It was a bright Wednesday afternoon in Tennessee, the kind where the sun hangs lazily in the sky and the highway stretches endlessly ahead. Jonathan Stevens, a former Marine who had traded his military uniform for a trucker's cap, was feeling the familiar ache in his back that came from hours behind the wheel. His red and silver semi-truck had been his constant companion for the past 3 years, ever since he'd left the Corps and decided to see America from a different perspective. The rest stop appeared ahead like an oasis, a simple concrete building surrounded by a few picnic tables and tall oak trees that provided patches of shade for weary travelers. Jonathan had stopped here countless times before, enough to know that the coffee was decent and the bathrooms were usually clean. As he guided his truck into the parking lot, he noticed it wasn't particularly busy, just a handful of cars scattered across the lot and a couple of other trucks idling in the designated spaces. The air was thick with summer humidity as Jonathan climbed down from his cab, his boots hitting the asphalt with a familiar thud. He'd learned long ago to never completely turn off his situational awareness. It was one of those things the Marines had drilled into him that had become second nature. Even now, as he walked toward the building, his eyes automatically scanned his surroundings, taking in details that most people would miss. There was something comforting about these routine stops, the mix of travelers passing through, families stretching their legs, other truckers nodding in silent acknowledgement. Jonathan had always been good at reading people, a skill honed by years of military service. He could usually tell the difference between a tired parent dealing with restless kids and someone having a genuinely bad day. Inside the rest stop, the air conditioning hit him like a welcome wave. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and the smell of coffee and cleaning supplies filled the air. He made his way to the men's room, then stopped by the vending area for a coffee and a bag of trail mix. Small pleasures, but they helped break up the monotony of long hauls. As he waited for his coffee to fill, Jonathan's mind wandered to his morning conversation with his sister. She'd been telling him about their mother's gardening project, how she'd somehow managed to grow tomatoes bigger than softballs this year. It made him smile, thinking about home and family. These were the kinds of thoughts that kept him company on the road. The coffee machine sputtered its last drops, and Jonathan grabbed his cup, dropping a couple of sugar packets into his pocket. He'd started cutting back on sugar lately, but sometimes, especially during these long afternoon stretches, he needed the extra sweetness to keep him alert. Walking back to his truck, Jonathan took his time. He'd learned early in his trucking career that rushing through breaks was a rookie mistake. These moments of stretching your legs, breathing fresh air, and letting your mind reset were essential for staying sharp on the road. Besides, he was ahead of schedule on this run. A delivery of automotive parts headed to a distribution center in Nashville. His years in the Marines had taught him to maintain a routine, even in civilian life. Each stop was methodical: fuel check, tire check, load check, brake, then back on the road. It wasn't exactly the same as military protocols, but having a system helped keep him focused and professional. The sun was still high enough to cast short shadows across the parking lot, and a light breeze had picked up, rustling through the oak leaves overhead. It was the kind of peaceful moment that made Jonathan appreciate his choice of profession. Sure, trucking could be solitary work, but there was something to be said for the freedom of the open road and the chance to see different parts of the country every week. As he approached his truck, Jonathan pulled out his phone to check his messages. His dispatcher had sent him an update about road work ahead, and he wanted to calculate if he needed to adjust his route. That's when he noticed a couple more vehicles had pulled into the rest stop, a blue sedan with out-of-state plates and a white delivery van. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary at first glance. The rest stop was doing its job, serving as a brief refuge for travelers making their way across the state. Jonathan had seen thousands of such scenes before, people coming and going, each wrapped up in their own journey, their own story. He was just about to climb back into his cab when something caught his attention. Later, he would thank his military training for keeping his senses sharp, for teaching him to notice details that seemed just slightly off. It was nothing dramatic, no screams, no commotion, just something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. In the Marines, they taught him that intuition wasn't just some mysterious sixth sense. It was your brain processing small details before your conscious mind had time to catch up. And right now, that intuition was telling him something wasn't right. Jonathan paused, one hand on the door of his truck, and casually scanned the parking lot again. This time he was looking more carefully, his mind shifting from tired trucker to trained observer. He'd been in enough situations, both in the military and civilian life, to know that sometimes the most dangerous moments started with the smallest of signs. The rest stop had grown quieter in the past few minutes. The family in the minivan had pulled away, leaving mainly the newer arrivals. A few birds were calling from the trees, and somewhere in the distance, the rumble of highway traffic provided a constant background noise. What happened next would turn this ordinary Wednesday afternoon into something very different. Jonathan didn't know it yet, but his next few decisions would prove crucial, not just for him, but for someone else whose life was about to intersect with his in an unexpected way. He stood there for a moment longer, coffee cooling in his hand, the summer breeze still rustling through the trees. Years of training and experience had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now, those instincts were telling him to pay attention. Something was about to happen at this quiet Tennessee rest stop that would require everything he'd learned as a Marine and everything he'd become since. Little did Jonathan know, his routine stop was about to become anything but ordinary, and the next few minutes would test not just his training, but his humanity as well. The peaceful afternoon was about to take a turn that would remind him why staying alert, even in the most mundane moments, could make all the difference in the world. At first, Jonathan almost missed it. The gesture was subtle, a quick movement in his peripheral vision that could have easily been dismissed as someone adjusting their hair or reaching for something. But there was something about it that made him look again, more carefully this time. Through the window of the blue sedan, he could see a young woman in the passenger seat. She was probably in her mid-20s, wearing a plain gray sweatshirt despite the summer heat. What caught his attention wasn't her appearance, but rather the deliberate way she held her hand. A fist raised slightly, thumb tucked inside, then extended forward in what seemed like a practiced motion. Jonathan felt his pulse quicken as recognition dawned. Just a few weeks ago, his sister had sent him a video about a new distress signal that had gone viral on social media. "You never know when this might be useful," she texted. The signal was simple but specific, designed to be a silent cry for help in situations where someone couldn't speak freely. He'd watched the video twice, mentally filing away the information as he did with anything that might one day prove important. Now, standing in the rest stop parking lot with his cooling coffee, Jonathan forced himself to appear casual while his mind raced through possibilities. The woman repeated the gesture, more urgently this time, when a man's figure moved away from the car toward the vending machines. Her eyes met Jonathan's for just a fraction of a second, and in that moment, he saw something that transported him back to his military days, the unmistakable look of someone trapped and desperate for help. The man walking away from the car was tall and solidly built, wearing jeans and a dark jacket. He moved with a purpose, but there was something off about his behavior too. He kept looking back at the car every few steps, his hand never far from his pocket. To most people, he might have looked like any other traveler, but Jonathan's trained eye caught the signs of someone trying too hard to appear normal. Drawing from his years of experience, Jonathan knew that rushing in without assessing the situation could make things worse. The Marines had taught him that the first response isn't always the best response. He needed more information, and he needed to be smart about how he gathered it. Moving with deliberate casualness, Jonathan walked back to the rest stop building, positioning himself where he could maintain a clear view of the car while appearing to check his phone. The woman in the car made the signal again, this time adding another gesture, tapping her wrist as if pointing to a watch. The message was clear. Time was important. The rest stop had grown quieter now, with only a handful of vehicles remaining in the lot. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the pavement, and the periodic whoosh of passing trucks on the highway provided a constant backdrop. Jonathan noticed how the man at the vending machines wasn't actually buying anything, just standing there, pretending to look at options, while keeping the car in his line of sight. Jonathan's mind raced through his options. Direct confrontation could be dangerous. If the man was armed, it could put everyone at risk. Calling out or making a scene might cause the man to panic and do something desperate. The woman's safety had to be the priority. He remembered a training exercise from his Marine days about hostage situations. The key was to create a network of help without alerting the perpetrator. Jonathan needed to act like everything was normal while setting up a response that would ensure everyone's safety. Taking another sip of his now-cold coffee, Jonathan casually walked toward his truck. His phone was in his hand, but instead of checking messages, he was quietly dialing 911. Years of practice allowed him to keep his voice steady and low as he described the situation to the dispatcher, all while maintaining his relaxed posture. "I'm at the eastbound rest stop on Highway 40, mile marker 283, he murmured into the phone, making it look like he was checking his delivery schedule. "There's a blue sedan, Tennessee plates." He spelled out the plate number he'd memorized earlier. "I've got reason to believe there's a woman in distress using the viral hand signal for domestic violence." The dispatcher's response was professional and focused, asking specific questions that Jonathan answered while pretending to take notes about his route. He described the man's appearance, the woman's signals, and every relevant detail he'd observed. All the while, he maintained his casual demeanor, knowing that any sudden change in behavior could tip off the man. Through his peripheral vision, Jonathan saw the man returning to the car. The woman quickly lowered her hand and turned to look out the passenger window. Her body language spoke volumes, the way she stiffened when the car door opened, how she kept her hands folded tightly in her lap. The dispatcher assured Jonathan that help was on the way, but asked him to stay on the line if possible. Highway patrol units were already being redirected to the rest stop, but it would take time for them to arrive. Those minutes could feel like hours in a situation like this. Jonathan knew he had to stay close without arousing suspicion. He walked to the back of his truck, pretending to check his tires and load straps. From this position, he could keep an eye on the blue sedan while appearing to go about his normal routine. Every few moments, he would quietly update the dispatcher about any changes in the situation. The air felt heavier now, charged with tension that only he seemed aware of. Other travelers came and went, completely oblivious to the drama unfolding in their midst. A family in a minivan pulled in, kids tumbling out heading for the restrooms. An elderly couple walked their small dog in the grass near the picnic tables. Normal life continued all around, while Jonathan stood as the only witness to a silent cry for help. He noticed the man in the car was becoming restless, checking his mirrors more frequently, his movements becoming more agitated. The woman remained still, but her eyes kept darting around, looking for help that she hoped was coming. Jonathan could see her hands trembling slightly as she maintained her composed facade. Time seemed to slow to a crawl. Jonathan checked his watch. Only 7 minutes had passed since he'd made the call, though it felt much longer. He knew from experience that these were the most critical moments. Whatever was going to happen would likely happen soon, as the man's increasing anxiety suggested he might be preparing to leave. The situation was balanced on a knife's edge. Jonathan had done everything right so far, maintained his cover, alerted authorities, kept eyes on the situation without raising alarm. But now came the hardest part, waiting while keeping himself ready to act if things suddenly escalated. As he stood there, pretending to check his logbook while actually monitoring every movement in and around the blue sedan, Jonathan reflected on how ordinary moments could suddenly become extraordinary. This rest stop, a place he'd passed through countless times before, had transformed into the stage for what could be a life-changing intervention. The next few minutes would prove crucial. Help was on the way, but until it arrived, Jonathan remained the only person who knew what was really happening in that parked car. His training, experience, and instincts had brought him this far. Now, he just had to trust that the system would work, that help would arrive in time, and that his quiet vigilance might make the difference between tragedy and rescue. As Jonathan continued his careful observation, his military training kicked in even stronger. Every detail suddenly became crucial. The way the man's right hand kept drifting toward his jacket pocket, the nervous tapping of his fingers on the steering wheel, the slight shake in the woman's shoulders as she sat rigidly in her seat. The rest stop had grown busier in the past few minutes. A school bus had pulled in, and a group of tired-looking teenagers spilled out, heading toward the building. Jonathan noticed how the man in the car tensed at the increased activity, his eyes constantly darting between his mirrors and the growing crowd. Through his earpiece, the 911 dispatcher continued providing updates. 2 highway patrol units were less than 10 minutes out, approaching from different directions to block any potential escape routes. Local police were also en route. Jonathan acknowledged with quiet murmurs, still maintaining his cover of a trucker doing routine checks. What worried him most was how the man's behavior was becoming increasingly erratic. He'd start the car, then shut it off again. He'd reach for his phone, check something, then throw it onto the dashboard in frustration. Each action made the woman flinch slightly, though she tried to hide it. Jonathan had seen this pattern before, the building tension before something breaks. Drawing from his experience, Jonathan began mentally mapping out scenarios. The rest stops layout offered both advantages and challenges. The main entrance was wide enough for 2 vehicles, but there was also a service road behind the building. If the man decided to run, he'd likely take the main exit. It was the clearest path to the highway. The woman caught his eye again, and this time he noticed something he'd missed before. There was a small bruise partially hidden by her hair, just behind her ear. His jaw tightened, but he maintained his composed exterior. Now he understood even better why she was using the distress signal. This wasn't just about the present moment, but probably days or weeks of fear leading up to it. A truck rumbled past on the highway, its horn blaring at something, and the man in the car visibly jumped. His hand went straight to his pocket, and Jonathan caught a glimpse of what looked like metal. The situation was escalating faster than he hoped. He quietly updated the dispatcher about the possible weapon, his voice steady despite the growing tension. The teenagers from the bus were now scattered around the parking lot, some sitting at picnic tables, others standing in small groups taking selfies. They were inadvertently creating a buffer zone between the blue sedan and the exit. Jonathan noticed how the man's frustration seemed to grow with each passing minute, his options for a quick getaway becoming more limited. Using his truck's side mirror, Jonathan kept watch while pretending to check his tire pressure. He'd positioned himself perfectly, able to see both the car and the rest stop entrance while appearing completely focused on his work. Years of training had taught him how to be invisible in plain sight, how to watch without being noticed. The woman made the distress signal one more time, more urgently now, when the man stepped out to pace beside the car. Her face showed a mix of hope and fear. Hope that help was coming, fear of what might happen before it arrived. Jonathan gave her the slightest of nods, just enough to let her know she'd been seen, that help was on the way. Time seemed to move differently in situations like this. Jonathan checked his watch. Only 4 minutes had passed since the last update from dispatch, but it felt like hours. He'd learned in the Marines that these moments of waiting were often the hardest part of any operation. The key was to stay focused, to keep your mind sharp while your body appeared relaxed. The air was thick with tension that only he and the car's occupants seemed aware of. Other travelers continued their routines, stretching legs, walking dogs, buying snacks. Normal life flowed around this pocket of silent crisis, like water around a rock in a stream. Jonathan noticed subtle changes in the man's behavior that others might miss. The way he stood slightly sideways, keeping his right side away from view. How his eyes tracked movement but never quite met anyone's gaze. The constant flexing of his hands, as if preparing for action. These were the details that told the story, one that Jonathan had unfortunately seen before. A mother walked past with 2 small children, heading toward the vending machines. The man shifted his position, using their presence as cover to move closer to the driver's side door. Jonathan felt his muscles tense, ready to move if necessary. But the man simply got back into the car, though his movements were more agitated now. The dispatcher's voice came through again, barely above a whisper in Jonathan's ear. The highway patrol units were now 5 minutes out. Local police had positioned themselves at both highway exits nearby. The net was closing, but these last few minutes would be critical. Drawing from his training, Jonathan began a mental inventory of everything around him that could be used if things went sideways. His truck's position gave him good cover. The concrete barriers near the parking lot could provide protection. The growing crowd of teenagers, while complicated, also meant the man would be less likely to do anything dramatic. He noticed how the woman kept her hands visible on her lap, how she seemed to be making herself as small as possible in her seat. These were the instincts of someone who had learned hard lessons about sudden movements. Jonathan felt a familiar surge of protective anger, but he kept it contained. Emotions could cloud judgment, and right now, clear thinking was essential. The sun had shifted, casting longer shadows across the parking lot. A cool breeze carried the sound of distant traffic and the chatter of teenagers. Jonathan maintained his position, balancing between staying close enough to intervene if needed and far enough away to avoid drawing attention. Years of experience had taught him that moments like these often ended in one of two ways, either with a quiet surrender when help arrived, or with a desperate attempt to escape just before. Everything about the man's body language suggested he was leaning toward the second option. The way he kept checking his mirrors, how his breathing had become more rapid, the constant movement of his hands. These were the signs of someone preparing to run. Jonathan quietly updated the dispatcher about these observations. His voice remained calm and professional, but inside he was preparing himself for whatever might come next. The Marines had taught him that the most dangerous moments often came right before resolution, when tension peaked and decisions had to be made in split seconds. The rest stop had become a stage where multiple stories were playing out at once, the obvious, everyday scene of travelers taking a break, and the hidden drama that only a few people knew was unfolding. Jonathan stood in both worlds, maintaining his cover while staying ready to step in if the situation suddenly changed. These were the moments that tested everything he'd learned, both in the military and in life since then. The ability to stay calm while alert, to appear casual while ready for action, to balance the need for intervention with the risk of making things worse. As the minutes ticked by, Jonathan knew that whatever happened next would depend on split-second decisions and years of training coming together at just the right moment. The sound of distant sirens changed everything. Though barely audible over the highway noise, Jonathan saw the man in the car stiffen, his head snapping toward the sound. The woman's hands gripped her knees tighter, her knuckles turning white. This was the moment Jonathan had been preparing for, when plans either come together or fall apart. The dispatcher's voice came through his earpiece, calm but urgent. Units are approaching with sirens off now. 2 minutes out. Jonathan acknowledged with a quiet word, keeping his eyes on the blue sedan while pretending to check his logbook. The teenagers from the bus were starting to gather near their vehicle, their teachers doing a head count. The timing couldn't have been better. Their presence near the exit would make it harder for anyone to leave in a hurry. Jonathan had positioned his truck strategically, ready to use it as a barrier if needed. Inside the car, the man was becoming more agitated. He started the engine, then killed it again. His hand kept moving to his jacket pocket, then away, a nervous gesture that made Jonathan increasingly uneasy. The woman remained still, but her eyes were constantly moving, watching both the man and the rest stop entrance. Jonathan's mind ran through the scenarios he'd been trained for. If the man tried to drive away, the highway patrol units would be in position to intercept. If he attempted to leave on foot, local police had the perimeter covered. The key was to keep everyone safe during these crucial moments when desperation could lead to rash decisions. The rest stop had taken on an eerie calm. The usual sounds of travelers and passing trucks seemed muffled, as if the world was holding its breath. Jonathan maintained his casual pose, while every muscle in his body stayed ready for action. Years of training had taught him that these moments of anticipation were often the most dangerous. Through the car's windows, Jonathan could see the man reaching for something in the back seat. The woman's face showed a flash of panic before she controlled her expression. Moving slowly but purposefully, Jonathan adjusted his position, using his truck's bulk to block any clear path to the highway. The dispatcher's updates came in whispers now, units in position. Unmarked vehicles approaching from the south entrance. Jonathan gave a subtle nod, though no one could see it. The net was closing, but these last few moments would require perfect timing. A family with small children walked past the blue sedan, completely unaware of the tension surrounding them. The man in the car froze, his hands still reaching behind him. Jonathan saw the woman close her eyes briefly, perhaps in prayer or relief at the momentary interruption. The air felt electric with possibility. Jonathan had been in enough similar situations to know that what happened next would depend on split-second decisions and careful coordination. His role was to stay ready while appearing completely ordinary, just another trucker checking his rig. More vehicles were pulling into the rest stop now, some of them moving with the deliberate precision that marked them as law enforcement, though they appeared ordinary enough to casual observers. They took positions that seemed random but effectively blocked any escape routes. The man in the car had noticed too. His movements became more jerky, less controlled. He turned the key in the ignition again, the engine roaring to life. The woman's hands pressed flat against her thighs, her body tense as if preparing for impact. Jonathan kept his voice steady as he updated the dispatcher. Vehicle running. Subject appears agitated. He moved to the front of his truck, still maintaining his casual demeanor while positioning himself to respond if needed. The rest stop's parking lot had become a stage set for what would happen next. The school bus group was still blocking the main exit, though they were starting to board their vehicle. Other travelers moved about their business, creating an unintentional barrier of ordinary life around the blue sedan. Time seemed to slow down as Jonathan watched the man reach for the gear shift. This was the moment when training and instinct would make the difference. He could see police units moving into position, their movements careful and coordinated. The woman in the car made the distress signal one final time, more urgently now. Her eyes met Jonathan's briefly, and he gave her the slightest nod of reassurance. Help wasn't just on the way, it was already there, invisible to most but ready to act. The sound of car doors opening and closing echoed across the parking lot as the police units made their final preparations. To anyone else, it would have seemed like normal rest stop activity. But Jonathan could see the pattern in it, the careful choreography of a planned intervention. The dispatcher's voice came through one last time. All units in position, stand by. Jonathan acknowledged with a quiet word, his body relaxed but ready. These next few moments would determine how this story ended. The tension in the air was almost visible now, like heat waves rising from hot pavement. The man in the car was gripping the steering wheel so tight his knuckles had gone white. The woman sat perfectly still, as if afraid any movement might trigger what came next. Jonathan had positioned himself where he could see everything, while appearing to be doing nothing more than routine truck maintenance. His years of experience told him that what happened in the next few minutes would depend on countless small decisions and precise timing. The rest stop had become a contained universe where two realities existed simultaneously, the normal flow of travelers taking a break from their journeys and the hidden drama that was about to unfold. Jonathan stood at the intersection of these worlds, ready to bridge them if necessary. As the sun continued its slow descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the parking lot, Jonathan knew that everything was in place. The careful planning, the strategic positioning, the coordination between different agencies, it was all about to come together. The next few moments would determine whether this would end quietly or become something else entirely. The next 20 minutes felt like both an eternity and a heartbeat. Jonathan maintained his position by his truck, watching as the man in the blue sedan grew increasingly agitated. Every few seconds, the man would check his mirrors, his movements becoming more erratic with each passing moment. The woman remained absolutely still, her shoulders tight with tension. Through the windshield, Jonathan could see her taking slow, measured breaths, the kind of breathing someone does when they're trying to stay calm in a crisis. He'd seen that same controlled panic before, during his tours overseas. The school bus finally pulled away from the rest stop, taking with it the crowd of teenagers that had been inadvertently providing cover. As the lot cleared slightly, the unmarked police vehicles became more noticeable, though they still maintained their casual positioning around the perimeter. Jonathan kept his observations flowing to the dispatcher in quiet, measured tones. Subjects becoming more agitated. Right hand keeps moving to jacket pocket. Woman appears unharmed but frightened. His voice remained steady, professional, though his heart was racing with the building tension. A truck stop wasn't meant to be a battleground, but that's what it had become. A silent confrontation playing out among the everyday chaos of travelers and truckers. The man in the car tried starting the engine again, but this time something was different. The sound of the starter grinding suggested he was turning the key too hard, his growing panic affecting his actions. Through his earpiece, Jonathan heard the tactical team coordinating their approach. They were timing it carefully, waiting for the perfect moment when the risk to the woman and other travelers would be lowest. Every minute that passed was another minute of intelligence gathered, another minute to ensure they had every angle covered. The woman caught Jonathan's eye again, and this time he could see something had changed in her expression. There was still fear there, but also something else, determination, perhaps even hope. She'd noticed the subtle signs of rescue approaching, signs that her captor was too distracted to see. The sun had shifted position, and now long shadows stretched across the parking lot. The changing light meant the man had to squint to check his mirrors, making him more frustrated. Jonathan watched as he repeatedly wiped his forehead, his movements becoming more aggressive each time. Time seemed to move differently in these situations. Jonathan had learned this during his military days, how 20 minutes could feel like hours when every second might bring a dramatic change. He kept his body relaxed but ready, knowing that appearance of casualness was crucial to keeping the situation from escalating. More travelers had entered the rest stop, creating a complex choreography of movement around the parked vehicles. Each new arrival made the man more nervous, his head snapping around at every sound. The woman's hands remained folded in her lap, but Jonathan could see her fingers twisting together, betraying her anxiety. The dispatcher's voice came through again, updating him on the tactical team's position. They were getting closer, using the natural flow of rest-stop traffic as cover. Jonathan acknowledged with a quiet word, all while maintaining his pose of a trucker doing routine checks. A family van pulled into the spot 2 spaces away from the blue sedan. 2 small children tumbled out, their laughter cutting through the tension. The man in the car visibly flinched at the sound, his hand jerking toward his pocket again. Jonathan felt his own muscles tense, ready to move if necessary. The afternoon heat was still intense, and Jonathan could see sweat running down the man's face. The woman remained perfectly still, her breathing the only visible movement. She'd shifted slightly in her seat, though, positioning herself closer to the door, a subtle move that told Jonathan she was preparing for whatever came next. Through the windows of surrounding vehicles, Jonathan caught glimpses of tactical team members moving into position. They were good, their movements so natural that even he, knowing what to look for, had trouble spotting them sometimes. The net was drawing tighter, but so slowly and carefully that it was almost invisible. The rest stop's normal sounds continued, car doors slamming, children calling to parents, trucks idling in the distance. But underneath it all was a current of tension that seemed to grow stronger with each passing minute. Jonathan knew from experience that these moments of waiting were often the hardest part. In the car, the man had begun talking, his mouth moving rapidly though Jonathan couldn't hear the words. The woman's responses were minimal, small moans or shakes of her head. Her face remained carefully blank, showing neither agreement nor defiance. It was the face of someone who had learned exactly how much emotion was safe to show. Jonathan kept track of every detail while appearing to be absorbed in his logbook. The way the man's right foot was tapping against the floor, how the woman's hands had shifted slightly, ready to move quickly if needed. The positioning of each tactical team member, now barely visible among the regular rest-stop traffic. The dispatcher's updates became more frequent, though still quiet. Team in position, awaiting final signal. Jonathan gave a slight nod, knowing the cameras positioned around the rest stop would pick up his acknowledgement. Everything was ready. Now it was just a matter of perfect timing. As the minutes ticked by, Jonathan noticed small changes in the scene. The men's movements became more predictable. Check mirrors, reach for pocket, look around, repeat. The woman had settled into a pattern too, her body still but her eyes constantly moving, taking in every detail of her surroundings. The air felt heavy with possibility, like the moments before a summer storm. Jonathan knew from experience that these situations usually broke one of 2 ways, either with a sudden burst of action or with a quiet surrender. Everything about the man's body language suggested it wouldn't be the quiet option. Time continued its slow crawl forward. Each minute brought them closer to resolution, though none of the ordinary travelers hurrying in and out of the rest stop knew they were walking through a scene of carefully contained crisis. Jonathan maintained his position, ready for whatever came next, knowing that these final moments would require all his training and experience. The intervention happened so smoothly that most people at the rest stop didn't even realize what was taking place. One moment, everything was tense anticipation. The next, it was coordinated action moving like a well-oiled machine. It started when a middle-aged man in a polo shirt, who Jonathan now recognized as an undercover officer, accidentally on purpose dropped his coffee near the blue sedan. The spill created a natural distraction, causing the man in the car to look away from his mirrors for just a moment. That split second was all they needed. 2 unmarked police vehicles smoothly pulled up, boxing in the sedan with practiced precision. Before the man could react, tactical team members seemed to materialize from nowhere, emerging from nearby cars, walking paths, and even from behind Jonathan's truck. The woman in the car saw them first. Jonathan watched as her body language shifted from rigid fear to cautious hope. Her captor was still focused on the coffee spill when the first officer reached the driver's side door. The man's hand darted toward his pocket, but he never had the chance to reach whatever was hidden there. The takedown was swift and professional. 4 officers moved in perfect synchronization, each knowing their role. The driver's door opened, and the man was quickly but carefully removed from the vehicle. There was a brief struggle, more instinct than actual resistance, before he was secured. Jonathan maintained his position, still playing his part as just another trucker doing his checks. He watched as a female officer gently approached the passenger side, speaking softly to the woman through the window. The door opened slowly, and the woman stepped out on shaking legs. The rest stop had gone quiet, travelers finally noticing that something unusual was happening. Parents pulled their children closer, truck drivers paused in their routes, and a small crowd began to gather at a safe distance. The tactical team had created a protective barrier, keeping onlookers away while preserving evidence and protecting the woman's privacy. Only now did Jonathan allow himself to relax slightly, though he stayed alert. His military training had taught him that even seemingly resolved situations could turn chaotic in an instant. But the tactical team had everything well in hand, their movements precise and practiced. The man was already secured in the back of an unmarked police car, his protests muffled by the closed doors. Jonathan noticed how the officers maintained their professional demeanor, treating their suspect with firm but appropriate control. There was no roughness, no excessive force, just well-trained law enforcement doing their job. The woman was now sitting in the back of an ambulance that had arrived silently during the takedown. A paramedic draped a blanket around her shoulders, while another checked her vital signs. Her face showed a mix of emotions, relief, exhaustion, and something that looked like disbelief that the ordeal was actually over. State police investigators had arrived and were processing the scene with methodical efficiency. They'd photographed the vehicle, collected evidence, and interviewed witnesses. Jonathan watched as they worked, appreciating the thoroughness of their approach. This wasn't just about making an arrest, it was about building a solid case. A detective approached Jonathan, notebook in hand. The questions were direct but thorough. When had he first noticed the signal? What exactly had he observed? Had the suspect made any specific movements or statements? Jonathan provided clear, detailed answers, drawing on his military training to report facts without embellishment. The rest stop was returning to its normal rhythm, though now with an undercurrent of excitement. Travelers who had been there for the takedown were sharing their stories with newcomers, though most had only seen the final moments. Few realized how many hours of careful observation and planning had led to those few seconds of action. Jonathan noticed how the tactical team maintained their presence, some members still watching the perimeter while others assisted with evidence collection. They moved with the quiet confidence of professionals who had trained extensively for exactly this type of situation. The woman was still in the ambulance, now talking with a victim advocate who had arrived on scene. Her posture had changed, shoulders straighter, head held higher. Though still clearly shaken, she seemed to be growing stronger with each passing minute, as if the reality of her rescue was finally sinking in. More law enforcement vehicles had arrived, their lights flashing silently in the late afternoon sun. Officers directed traffic around the scene, keeping the rest stop functional while preserving the integrity of their investigation. It was a careful balance of maintaining public service while conducting police work. Jonathan gave his contact information to the detective, knowing there would likely be follow-up questions in the days to come. He'd seen enough cases to know that thorough documentation now would help ensure justice later. The woman caught his eye as paramedics prepared to transport her to the hospital. She gave him a small nod, a gesture of thanks that conveyed more than words could have. Jonathan returned the nod, relieved to see the fear gone from her eyes, replaced by what looked like the beginning of healing. State police were now interviewing other witnesses, building a comprehensive picture of events. Jonathan overheard fragments of conversations, travelers describing what they'd seen, truck drivers sharing their observations. Each piece of information would help construct the official record. The sun was lower now, casting long shadows across the scene. The blue sedan was being carefully searched, every item documented and photographed. Evidence bags were filled, labeled, and secured. Nothing was rushed. Every procedure was followed with precise attention to detail. As the ambulance prepared to leave, Jonathan noticed how the tactical team had positioned themselves to block any photos or videos from onlookers. They were protecting the woman's privacy even now, demonstrating the kind of professionalism that went beyond just making an arrest. The detective returned with a few final questions, then handed Jonathan his card. "We'll need a formal statement," he explained. "And there might be a grand jury down the line." Jonathan nodded, knowing this was just the beginning of a long legal process. The rest stop was almost back to normal now, though the police presence remained. New travelers came and went, most unaware they were walking through the scene of what would likely become a significant case. Jonathan watched as the ambulance finally pulled away, its lights flashing but siren silent. His part in this story was nearly over, but Jonathan knew the impact would last. Sometimes the most important moments happen in the most ordinary places, like a highway rest stop on what had started as just another Wednesday afternoon. In the days that followed, the impact of what happened at the rest stop rippled outward like waves in a pond. Jonathan learned from the detectives that the man was wanted in 3 states for a string of serious crimes. The woman, they discovered, had been missing for 3 days, taken from a parking lot hundreds of miles away. A week after the incident, Jonathan sat in his truck at another rest stop, this time in Ohio, thinking about how a single moment of awareness had changed so many lives. His phone contained several messages from the detective handling the case, updating him on the investigation's progress. The woman was safe now, reunited with her family and receiving support from professionals who specialized in helping survivors of trauma. She had sent a thank you note through the police department, just a few lines on plain paper that meant more to Jonathan than any official commendation could. Local news had picked up the story, though they kept the woman's identity private. The headlines focused on the importance of knowing modern distress signals and the value of trusting one's instincts. Jonathan had declined interviews, preferring to stay in the background. For him, the best reward was knowing he'd helped someone in need. The case had sparked important conversations within the trucking community. At truck stops across the country, drivers shared the story, teaching each other about the hand signal and discussing ways to stay alert for people in trouble. Companies began incorporating awareness training into their safety programs. Jonathan found himself paying even closer attention during his routes, watching for signs that someone might need help. Other drivers he met at stops would sometimes recognize him from the incident, leading to thoughtful discussions about the role truckers could play in keeping highways safer for everyone. The police department had asked Jonathan to speak at a training session for new officers. Standing before a room of fresh-faced recruits, he emphasized the importance of observation and patience. Sometimes the biggest moments start with the smallest details, he told them, describing how a simple hand gesture had led to stopping a criminal and saving a life. Social media platforms began sharing educational videos about the distress signal, reaching millions of viewers. Organizations working with domestic violence survivors reported increased awareness of safety resources. The simple hand gesture that had caught Jonathan's attention was now helping others find their way to safety. In his quieter moments, Jonathan often reflected on the sequence of events that had unfolded that Wednesday afternoon. If his sister hadn't sent him that video about the distress signal, if he hadn't maintained his situational awareness, if he had dismissed that first glimpse of movement, how differently things might have turned out. The incident had reinforced something Jonathan had learned in the Marines, that everyday heroes don't wear capes or seek attention. They're the people who stay alert, who notice when something's wrong, who take action when needed. Sometimes, heroism is as simple as paying attention and making a phone call. 2 months after the rest stop incident, Jonathan received word that the case had led to breaks in several other investigations. The men's arrest had created a domino effect, helping law enforcement connect dots they'd been trying to link for months. Other victims came forward, finding courage in the story of one woman's rescue. During a stop in Tennessee, Jonathan passed by that same rest area where it had all happened. It looked exactly the same. Travelers coming and going, trucks idling in their designated spots, families stretching their legs on long journeys. Yet for him, it would always be the place where being observant made all the difference. The woman's case moved through the legal system with the steady pace of justice. Jonathan provided testimony to the grand jury, describing in detail what he had observed that day. His military training had served him well, helping him deliver clear factual accounts that strengthened the prosecution's case. Other trucking companies reached out, asking Jonathan to help develop training materials for their drivers. He worked with them to create programs that taught not just about the hand signal, but about the broader importance of maintaining awareness on the road. His experience became a teaching tool that would help others recognize and respond to similar situations. As seasons changed and miles accumulated on his truck, Jonathan kept in touch with the detective who had handled the case. Each update brought news of progress, both in the legal proceedings and in the woman's recovery. She had become an advocate herself, working with organizations to help other survivors find their way to safety. The rest stop incident had created a ripple effect of positive change. Security cameras at highway stops were upgraded, staff received additional training, and public awareness of trafficking and domestic violence increased. Small improvements that, added together, made the roads a little safer for everyone. Jonathan's sister had framed the newspaper article about the rescue, though his name wasn't mentioned. She kept it on her wall as a reminder that sometimes the most important messages come in unexpected ways, like a video she decided to share with her brother one ordinary morning. A year after the incident, Jonathan received a commendation from the governor's office for his role in the rescue. The ceremony was small, just how he preferred it. The real reward, he knew, wasn't in the certificate or the handshakes, but in knowing that someone was safe because he had paid attention and taken action. The story became part of law enforcement training programs across several states, teaching officers about the importance of civilian observation and cooperation. Jonathan's experience showed how one person's awareness could set in motion a chain of events that would help not just one person, but potentially many others. Looking back, Jonathan realized that heroism often doesn't look like what we expect. Sometimes it's just a matter of being in the right place at the right time and being prepared to act when needed. His military training, his trucking experience, and his sister's shared video had all come together at exactly the right moment. The legacy of that Wednesday afternoon continued to grow, touching lives in ways Jonathan never expected. But for him, the most important outcome was knowing that somewhere, someone who had been in desperate need of help was now safe, free, and rebuilding their life, all because he had noticed a simple hand signal at a highway rest stop.